Hello and welcome to another session of Nerve. We are really excited to welcome everyone tonight. My name is Siobhan and I'm here with my co-host Julianne. Darby's not joining us tonight, but he is also part of the super team that is the Neural Engineering Research Venture. And our goal is to bring neuroscience to life at Africa and around the world. So sorry, I have a second tab open. I'm going to start off tonight with a few announcements. Some really exciting opportunities that we'd love to share with you. The first one is a new venture called the Neuro Launchpad, and they are a virtual seminar series designed to give exposure to postgrads. So if you're a grad student or a postdoc and you're looking for a platform to present your work, please check them out. They're running their seminars from October to December, and they are already accepting submissions. Then if you are looking for a PhD and you are living in Africa, or you more specifically are an African, the DeepMind scholarships have made it here, and they're offering scholarships in the fields of machine learning and artificial intelligence at Stellenbosch University. The scholarship is extensive. Pretty much all your fees will be covered. So if you are interested and ready to start in February 2021, please do apply. Closer in the future than that, we have the Autumn School in Neuroscience, which Oxford will be hosting online, and this will be at the end of this month. And then something else to look out for is the Neuromatch Super Conference, which will be hosted at the end of October. And they are branching out from computational neuroscience, so they are including all fields. So whatever field of neuroscience you're from, please apply. Talk applications close on the 2nd of October. So please do submit your abstracts. Then before we get going with the formal talk, just a few house rules. Please remember that we're all from different backgrounds and different contexts. So please always use respectful and inclusive language. We would love to have your questions and any comments you may have at the end. So please post your questions using the Ask a Question feature. During the talk, vote for your favorite questions as well, as the more popular questions are more likely to be asked first. We would love to have you join us on screen. It does make for a great experience, but if for any reason you aren't able to, then please just add "please ask" to your question and we will ask on your behalf. If you're struggling with connectivity, the best thing to do is refresh your browser. And if you really are struggling, then the talk will be available to stream after the event at the same link. So do not despair. We will be here. And that's it with the formalities. Julianne will introduce our speaker now.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Nerve. I'm very excited to introduce Pelonomi Moiloa tonight as our speaker. With an educational background in biomedical and electrical engineering and a Mail and Guardian Top 200 achievement in 2019, Pelonomi is currently a data scientist at NetBank, where she works on machine learning solutions with the data-driven intelligence team. She spends her spare time advocating for machine learning fairness, youth coding initiatives, and mobilizing tech and women communities. Also, she is a self-proclaimed tree hugger. So with this, I will now hand over to Pelonomi, who will be our speaker.
Okay. Cool. Hello, everyone. Cool. Yeah. So my name is Pelonomi, as has been stated. And yeah, I just would like to iterate what Siobhan has said about trying to make this thing as interactive as possible. It's super strange just talking to a computer. And the computer doesn't really talk back, so please feel free to put all sorts of comments in the comment section. I know that there is a Ask a Question section, so keep your questions to there, and then people can just have a good time in the comments and entertain me while I'm presenting to you all. And yes, yeah, so the first thing that I do want to try and do is try not to make too many assumptions about who it is that I am speaking to. I would like to make it as relevant as possible. So I would like for you to just let me know by putting in the comment section the number of which one of these assumptions doesn't apply to you, so that I can get a bit of a better idea of who I'm talking to and make sure that you take something away from this that is valuable. And yeah, just to start, my background is in electrical and biomedical engineering. Before I worked at a bank, I thought I was going to go work at Neuralink, but no, I'm at a bank instead. And before that, I was at a neuroscience lab where I did my master's degree in Japan. And my sensei, the man on the right over here, this lovely person, his particular interest and field of expertise was in neurophysiology. So he was also specifically interested in neurological disorders such as Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease and understanding the physiological methods around that. So what my master's ended up looking at was something like this, which is around calcium imaging, which is just one of the many ways you can image the brain. You have these two little neurons over here, for example, and you get an action potential, which is just a neural signal in the brain with one cell talking to the other. You've loaded the cell with a calcium fluorescent dye, and when you get this neural signal, you get this calcium that rushes into the cells to tell it that a signal has arrived and that it needs to do something. And the calcium binds to a fluorescent dye. That fluorescent dye then glows once it comes into contact with the calcium, which makes the cell glow. And that cell glow is then happening in a petri dish within a wrap lane slice or something. And you're able to visualize that. So you see this little glowing dot. It is glowing. It's changing in intensity, believe me. You'll just have to take my word for it, even though it doesn't look like it. And looking at the change in gray intensity value over time, you're then able to get neural signals. And what these neural signals then give you is some neural cell activity, right? And all of the science is really because calcium dysregulation and homeostasis is linked to neuropathological disease, like Parkinson's disease. And understanding it is supposed to be able to help these people. So guys like him, who are infected with Parkinson's disease, and it makes their lives more difficult than they want them to be. And so it had a really human component in terms of what I was aspiring to help people do. But this was his thesis title, Automated Segmentation of Low Contrast Calcium Fluorescence Neural Image Sequences. Has very little to do with the real feeling component behind what I was trying to achieve. My approach wasn't very successful. I was using LSTMs, deep learning network, and I wasn't very good. But point aside, I would like to ask you the question, assuming that a number of you are in the field of neuroscience research, and even in terms of neuroscience applications, or whatever applications you are from, is how often do you think about the things your work will make decisions about? I think the only time I really thought about the Parkinson's patients is when I was making the introduction slide to my presentation. And maybe at like 3 o'clock in the morning when I was walking home from my lab and I walked past a little rock that was a little memorial dedication to all the little mice and rats who had given their lives in the name of science. But I suppose the point that I'm coming to here is that when machine practitioners don't think about the things that their work affects, then they are at risk at violating social norms. And normally I talk about violations of social norms in terms of machine learning and AI with things that make the headlines, such as extremism being driven by YouTube's algorithm because extremism drives engagement, or Google is a big company, so they make lots of mistakes, and they keep trying to fix them, and they keep not quite fixing them. Algorithms that affect humans directly, such as cutting healthcare or firing them even though they were a good teacher or nurse. Incidents like that have appeared a lot in the news. This is a really big one that is still quite common in terms of looking at AI bias and how this popular algorithm, which helps law enforcers, I think in Florida, help decide who goes to jail and who doesn't, and what their risk of recidivism, that's what it's called. So what is the likelihood that they will reoffend, and those types of things inform then what their sentence will be, how much bail they will get, etc., etc. And the thing is found to be kind of racist and sexist too. And I think what is even more concerning than these algorithms that do really bad things is that, for example, here we have the Stanford Institute for Human and Centered Artificial Intelligence. And their aim is to be broadly representative of good AI and who it aims to serve and what it aims to do. And I don't know if you notice anything in there. Maybe you don't, because you're one of these people. I'm joking. But what these things really do come down to is this stuff. We often talk about morality and ethics, which includes security and privacy, biases, fairness, transparency, so ensuring that you are communicating the truth about the machine that's developed, interpretability, so being able to understand how a machine makes its decisions, robustness, so once you've taken your machine out of its little context of developers at a particular place and time, scaling that up into the broader world, does it still perform in the same way? And then also accountability. So when we haven't gotten all the other stuff right, whose fault is it and how can we correct those processes? And those three things then filter out into these three different stages of machine development. And first of which is like this machine conceptualization stage, which then moves into the machine development stage and then releasing the machine out there into the world. And there is a lot of work being done in trying to make what the definition of good AI is, AI that doesn't make mistakes or doesn't discriminate against people, for example. And there's two conferences that may be of interest to you. The first one is the ACM conference on fairness and accountability and transparency. And then there's another conference, FATML. And I think that FATML stands for fairness, accountability, and transparency. And there's a lot of research going into how to make these algorithms do better work. And so the first place that we look at trying to make good AI is trying to ensure that machines are context-driven in their success criteria. So making sure that we're giving the right problems to our machines to solve, and that they're informed by ethics, that they're informed by legislation, that they're informed by privacy, and ensuring that we have the right intentions about what our machine is supposed to do, what decisions it needs to make. There's a lot of work out there that's gone into the machine development phase in terms of algorithmic fairness. This paper that I've referenced at the bottom over here is really great. It talks about pre-processes, in-processes, and post-processes in terms of the mechanisms you can use in order to mitigate things like bias. And it also tells you in which contexts, which mechanisms are best to use. And other than that, there are so many GitHub repos about different types of algorithmic fairness, algorithms themselves to detect all sorts of stuff that are meant to help you in the machine development phase to ensure, for example, that your machine doesn't have bias, or to ensure that it's interpretable in some kind of way. And then the last step in the process is looking at accountability. So accountability, yes, is in terms of legislation and law and making sure that we have the right correctional processes when things go wrong. But it's also in terms of strengthening the cycle of knowledge transfer practices that are coming into play in terms of what are the specific checkboxes we should be ticking in terms of machine development before we release it out into the world. IBM in July just released their second paper on fact sheets, and I think it's broadly based off of Timnit Gebru's and her friends' idea of data sheets for data sets. So data sheets for data sets are supposed to capture all the information about a data set before it gets shared out and when it gets shared out, so that when people use that data set, they're aware of why it was created, who it was created for, with what it was created, what it should entail, what it contains, who funded it, things like that. And that's really important for data. I mean, the main data set that comes to mind is ImageNet, which is is the largest image data set in the world that a lot of people use to train their image recognition algorithms on. And 2/3 of that data set is from the Western world. So for us South Africans, for example, if you want your machine algorithm trained off of ImageNet to recognize Pup and Face or your Stony, it won't be able to do that because the likelihood of those images appearing in that data set is very, very low. And then IBM's fact sheets does the same kind of thing as the data sheet, but it does it for the model itself. So it tells you why the model was created, who it was created for, what kind of biases it may have, what kind of metrics it was tested on, whether it was tested for robustness, etc., etc. And the idea is that if we think about these steps at all these different processes, and if we get these things right, then we'll get good AI. AI that doesn't make mistakes and make mistakes, really big mistakes and really bad decisions about people's lives. And I mean, it can be a little bit difficult to try and conceptualize where this all fits in terms of good AI and neuroscience. The examples that I've given you, yeah, sure, make absolute sense in terms of the real world. But I mean, even for me, when I sat down to do this presentation, I was like, oh, where does it fit in? And I think in the broader sense of neuroscience, we have these two spheres. We have this experimental research sphere, and there are certain questions there in terms of how close they are, in fact, to releasing those models out into the public, and whether there isn't that much of a risk or that much of a threat there. And then we have the other side of established technologies where we do actually have devices that are infiltrating into the world and into society and acting on people. And these two worlds have different kind of ethical concerns. And so I've heard things like this, like my subject is brainwaves, not people. It can be difficult to relate the people aspect to your research when your research is so particularly focused on this teeny tiny little thing, and contextualizing that in terms of the brain as a whole and as a person and then as a world, it can be really difficult. I've also heard things like, I don't deploy anything, it's a lot of exploratory work. Like, if I'm not going to deploy this, is it really going to affect people? So brains are so difficult already. And so thinking even more about all of these extra things you need to think about to ensure that your machine is doing the right thing can be overwhelming, especially if you don't know where to start and where to begin and what you should be considering and what you shouldn't. And then open neural data so we can advance neuroscience. I think there's a desperate need for us to spread the art of neuroscience into all the corners of the world, and also to ensure that it is accessible to people who otherwise wouldn't have access to it. Because I mean, technology is meant to empower, and we don't want to empower the already empowered. We also want to lift up those who don't necessarily have as much. And I was a little bit overwhelmed by all of this, but luckily I came across this paper on like Monday, and it was released in March in 2020. And I think what is really cool about this field of neuroethics and understanding where neuroscience and machine learning needs to think about it, how it fits into the world, is that it's really, really new. And we're starting to think about these things even before these devices are being launched out into the world, because we're really in the early stages of understanding how to create brain applications. And so, yeah, I'm glad we're getting started, but the stuff is new. And this dude, his name's Marcello, he's identified these four main paradigms of clinical neuroscience as diagnosis, for example, diagnosis mechanisms for identifying things like ADHD or severe depression, schizophrenia. Prediction, so being able to predict events in the brain before they happen. It has applications in things like predicting epileptic seizures before they happen in modeling. So trying to understand the mechanisms of the brain and how it works. There's a absolutely wonderful, lovely little love relationship between reinforcement learning and neuroscience, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But that's using machine learning to try and understand the mechanisms of the brain, and then, understanding how the brain works a little bit better by trying to model it. And then the field of neurotechnology, which is aiming to create technological devices that act on people in order to be able to do certain things. And he identifies the four main concerns around these four application areas. And these are neuroprivacy, so the privacy of neural information, the risk of discrimination. We know that discrimination within algorithms is a big thing, and even more so as we develop more technologies. Accountability and autonomy and agency. So these are the four main issues that he's identified. So I'm going to run with these at the moment. I've shamelessly copied and pasted this diagram from his paper. Oh, by the way, if you do want to find that paper, it may be a bit difficult to find, but I did find the full text at this ResearchGate link. So if you do want to have a look at it, it'll be there. And so these four things were then encompassed by what he calls scientific validity. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that a bit later as well. And scientific validity is just with regards to the methodologies that we use in order to investigate these paradigms of neuroscience and the risks involved. And so I just wanted to explore these a little bit in depth. I found this really interesting article on Nature, and it talked about deep brain stimulation. And it was recording, it was an ethics article, but it was also looking at the experience of patients who had received deep brain stimulation. And there was just parts in these, in this article that, that were so relevant to these four areas of concern. And I'm going to read them out to you if you're too lazy to read. So the first one is, scientists at social media platform Facebook are known to be pursuing brain reading techniques for use in headsets that would convert users' brain activity into text. Now, I don't know about you, but I get super annoyed when I Google something and the Facebook ad pops up. I can't even imagine if I have like this VR headset that uses my brain activity to play a game or for some kind of functionality, even worse if it's a medical device. And now this information has been shared with a third party like Facebook, and I'm suddenly getting ads based off of my like subconscious activity. And I mean, I think that's the mildest irritation that could occur from a neuroprivacy infringement. There's also concern, for example, of neural hacking into devices, and then being able to control neural devices like a deep brain stimulation device, because they often rely on technologies like Wi-Fi, it's like wireless internet, on Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and they're not completely foolproof. And then the other major concern is that, I mean, your brain waves have neuromarkers that may be indicative of certain neural states, and therefore certain neural disease. And it's been shown that you're able to detect whether somebody will develop, for example, Alzheimer's disease in the next couple of years to a certain level of probability through just analyzing what's going on in their brain. And I mean, if that is then shared with a third party insurance company, for example, that can be really problematic if they then start to now reduce the cover that they have for you because they've detected in your brain that you may have an issue later on. So yeah, how comfortable would you feel about scientists having access to your brainwaves? In terms of neurodiscrimination, the piece that was super interesting for me was reports have surfaced about a minority of people who undergo deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease becoming hypersexual or developing other impulse control issues. One person with chronic pain became deeply apathetic after DBS treatment. So even with small experiments like these, we're able to identify minorities that do not respond to the algorithm or the neural model in the way that we expect them to. And in fact, they respond in ways that are detrimental to them, yeah. And I mean, we already know that a lot of algorithms are discriminating in other ways. For example, we know that facial recognition doesn't work on black skin as it does on white skin, even worse on black females. And I mean, by this logic, we haven't necessarily understood how biases seep into neural devices, but we can assume that we will have some problems. And with that being said, I mean, do you think that standard neural-based AI would work as well on black females as they do on white males? Also considering who is involved in the development of this process and who has access to developing these kinds of technologies just in general, in terms of the representation of people within tech. Yeah, and the next issue is accountability. And I'll read this piece out for you. Some effects that might be described as personality changes are more problematic than others. There was a deep brain stimulation patient who started to gamble compulsively, blowing his family savings and seeming not to care. He could only understand how problematic his behavior was when the stimulation was turned off. You have these very strange situations of shared or hybrid agency. It opens up a problem, an accountability gap. And this is a major philosophical problem. I definitely do not have the means to even attempt to answer a question like this, and I'm really interested to hear what other people have to think. But the idea of autonomy, of accountability in terms of understanding who's at fault can be difficult. I mean, here the question is, if a decision was half made by you and half made by the device, who is held accountable when something goes wrong? And in this article, they talk about how you start to acquire this merged/hybrid state. They talk about having a symbiotic relationship with technology. One of the women, her study ended, and they had to remove the device from her, and she just pushed back for as long as possible because she was so dependent on this device, and eventually said she had lost herself when she had lost the device. And I mean, when you are so in tune with the device itself and you are not separate from it, then whose fault is it if something goes wrong? And the last one was autonomy and agency. This is also super interesting. And it talks about autonomy and agency, and let me just read this piece for you. So it says, the effects of closed-loop brain stimulation devices on patients' subjective experience, including their sense of agency and psychological continuity, and I'll talk a little bit more about psychological continuity a bit later, have been differently interpreted as both feelings of estrangement, example, AI overriding subjective volition and identity, and boosted identity. So example, AI enabling a more authentic first-person experience have been reported. So within the study of deep brain stimulation patients, it seems like that there was a varying adoptive result of this technology into people's lives. Some people felt like they had lost themselves, that they could no longer identify with who they were. They started having questions about who they were. Because they now had this machine making decisions for them. They started asking questions like, who would I be, or what kind of decision would I make without this machine? And I think that reflects the estrangement sentiments. And then on the other side, some people were like, oh, this is great. I'm so much better with the technology. And like the woman that I mentioned earlier, and they really do benefit from the technology. And this question of autonomy and agency, yes, is extremely prevalent when you now have a device that is tapping directly into your decision-making center. But I think there can be some experience gained from other realms of bioethics where, I mean, with a lot of biomedical machine learning applications in diagnosis, for example, there's an ongoing debate about whether, well, I don't know if it's a debate, but a debate about whether machines should be made to make the final decision, even when they are more accurate than the human. So in this case, would you want the machine to make decisions for you if it may be better at it? And so I keep wanting to say Marcello. So Marcello has gone through these 4 paradigms of issues that he foresees within neuroscience. And in a different connection that I found of him expressing what his team and his friends are up to in terms of neuroethics, and came across these proposed human rights to integrate what AI and neuroscience as a team may introduce in terms of legal issues. And these are necessary because the type of issues that I was talking about earlier aren't necessarily covered by our current human rights. So the first one he proposes is mental integrity. Mental integrity currently already exists in human rights terms, along with physical integrity, but mental integrity at the moment seems to mostly apply to mental health type concerns. And the position here is that mental integrity should include to incorporate AI implications within mental health concerns. The second human right proposed is cognitive liberty. And this is basically liberty to access neurotechnology. He talks about neurotechnology in particular, and says he hasn't given much thought to something like neuropharmacology. And in this interview, the guy is interviewing Marcello, asks him whether cognitive liberty would then allow anyone in the world access to neuro-altering drugs. And essentially that's what cognitive liberty would be, is allowing people access to make decisions about how they want to alter their own brains. And then mental privacy, we spoke about the neuroprivacy as before, so ensuring that people can give consent and revoke consent to access to what is happening in their brains. And I mean, when we talk about mental privacy, I think we're quite far away from machines being able to interpret our thoughts, especially into a way that is human interpretable. But that doesn't mean to say that there isn't a lot of information that cannot be inferred from what we currently know about the brain and the signals we're able to obtain from it that is also super valuable. For example, there's instances of being able to, using other information sources, being able to link data from someone's brain to other data in order to identify a person. So yeah, the current privacy laws, I think in South Africa, we have POPI. The main one in the world is GDPR. And I think our one, POPI, will only be implemented in 2021. GDPR, I think, was enforced in 2018. And they do have certain laws and regulations around privacy, but it doesn't cover mental privacy. And then the last one is super philosophical. It's about psychological continuity. And it talks about how you as a human, I mean, you as a human 5 years ago and you as a human now, you are the same human. And what is it about that person and this person is the same that you can say that you are the same person and you have the same identity, even though you've gone through so many changes. And the reason why psychological continuity is here as a right is, for example, that person that I spoke about earlier who started gambling compulsively. The idea is that you should have consent towards changes in your psychological continuity. So that guy probably didn't want to start gambling compulsively. So that would be considered a violation against his right to psychological continuity. but this stuff is a lot. And I think for me, when I was going through all of this, I was like, this is great. This is all very well. This is all very exciting. I spent a lot of time reading about these things, but I just sat there and thinking, me as a person who's developing models and putting them into production, what can I do now? These human rights haven't been implemented. There's still neuroethicists arguing around what are the main risks and concerns of what is going on in the world. What can I do now? And I mean, we have these 3 steps and 3 steps in the process. We have the machine conceptualization, which is context-driven. But my main focus has been, and it's not to say not to focus on the other 2, but something that I would really like to hone in on is this idea of the context-driven success criteria. The first reason being that anything you do in machine development to correct for anything is what you're doing to correct for anything you didn't see in that context-driven success criteria stage. And anything in the machine release part that you do, except for, I guess, the best practices, is also corrections to things that you didn't think about in the machine conceptualization stage. And I'm also particularly interested in this machine conceptualization phase because the other 2 have technical and legislative solutions, whereas making sure that people make the right decisions about their machines is a lot more difficult to do. It's more of a societal influence / societal issue. And the way I would like to drive this home is through that little love story that I spoke about a little bit earlier, with reinforcement learning and neuroscience. And I just want to reiterate about the fact that problem context is really, really important. Now, we knew quite early on, I say this like I was there, but through experiments conducted, I think by, I always remember the first letter and never the rest of it, a dude whose name starts with an M. He did a whole lot of behavioral studies, and he has the most famous one on the dog and about how he trained the dog to be able to anticipate food by ringing a bell, and the dog would start salivating. And that then started this journey. I mean, if somebody knows, they can, there we go, Pavlov. We've started this journey about trying to understand the relationship between rewards and actions and rewards. And somewhere along the line after that, people in the computer society, well, my English is failing me, it's towards the end of the day. People within the world of computing were starting to look at reinforcement learning. And they came across a pattern of learning that was then adopted by neuroscience, and they've shared this relationship of learning and how people learn through reward and So how does reinforcement learning work? Well, you have this agent. An agent is able to perform an action within an environment. It then kind of makes before it performs that action, it makes a prediction about what the outcome of that action would be in terms of its value and its potential for it to gain reward. And then it then gets fed the state of the environment after the action was performed, and it gets the reward according to whatever action it was made. And the idea of going through this iterative process of the agent interacting with the environment through actions in order to maximize reward is to learn the best policy or strategy in order to get the most reward as possible. And the relationship between neuroscience and reinforcement learning that happened was, here we have this idea of maximizing reward within reinforcement learning. And it was found that, so if you have a mouse, for example, and you want to learn to navigate the maze, you give it a set number of actions it's allowed to perform. It then learns through experience by going through this maze after you giving it a reward function, how to best navigate the maze by so learning best policy or strategy that maximizes its total reward. And this idea of learning was then inherited by the neuroscience community in terms of understanding how dopamine works in the midbrain. And it was found that it follows a similar mechanism where you have this little agent, and the agent is able to perform particular actions. So, for example, in this case, you have a little mouse, and the actions it's able to perform is to drink normal water or water with some morphine in it, for example. And depending on the action it performs within this environment, it's able to then get a particular reward from that. In terms of dopamine, that is the reward. Dopamine is a good feeling hormone. It makes you feel good, makes you feel happy, and the more you get of it, the more you want it. And by this logic, we had experiments where the rat can learn the best policy, right, that maximizes the total reward. And I mean, this is a very basic and very simple conclusion of how addictive behaviors come about. There's a whole lot more complicated processes around it. But we can deduce that a mouse, for example, would choose to drink morphine water, for example, over normal water, because the morphine water would stimulate the release of dopamine in its brain, and it would therefore just keep going back to that process, which maximizes the reward, maximizes the dopamine. And there was a study conducted in this very case where the rat went through the process of trying to choose between normal water and water with morphine in it. And it kept going back to the water that gave it the dopamine response, made it feel good. And I think something like 100% of the rats in that study overdosed. However, the idea of this reinforcement loop in terms of how it functions within the brain is really context particular. So it was Dr. Bruce Alexander in the 1970s who did this experiment with rats, where he first put them in an empty cage and gave them normal water and morphine water, and the rats would overdose on morphine. Or if you give them the same two options between what water to drink, but you also give them a really amazing environment and amazing context in which to interact, he found that the rats very rarely went to the morphine filled water because they had other things to keep them happy. And so here we can see that even though we may have a model of the way something works, we need to ensure that we are considering the whole context before we make particular decisions about what that mechanism means. So in terms of this context, we might have considered the brain to be in the environment, but I think it is very easy to consider that the brain is the environment itself. But I think it's even more important to consider that the brain acts within an environment itself, and that environment is the world. And I mean, it brings back to these things that we were looking at, including the 3 steps in our process of morality and ethics and bias and whatever, but all of these are contextual. So, for example, if we're looking at now time compared to 60 years ago when women in the US weren't allowed to vote, or homosexuality was seen as a mental disorder, these things are contextual in terms of place and in terms of time. And in terms of bias, that too is contextual, even as a machine developer. I encourage you to go and take these implicit bias tests as often as you like, because your context changes as well, which means your implicit biases change as well. And your implicit biases are really just a reflection of the context that you live in. And if you're not aware of that context and what it means, then that context will find its way into your machines. And I mean, the reason why these contexts are so important is firstly this methodology thing. So Marcello identified it as, what was it? Well, he referred to a concern around neuroscience, clinical methodologies, and what that might mean in terms of issues with how science is conducted that may result in risk later on. And I think the major issue here is in terms of causality and how the decision boundaries that you decide as a machine learning engineer are imposed within that methodology. And assuming that the system is a result of the input and output, I mean, the relationship between your input and output is not your system. And it doesn't always mean that the relationship is causal. And when you do have these black boxes and you're doing this input-output, we sometimes forget that within this black box, we have context and environment as well. So not only is the black box operating in a context or in an environment, but context and environment is also embedded within the black box, which brings us to the second reason why contexts are important, and that is because we want to maintain social norms, or at least our aspiration for what social norms should be, because society, let's face it, isn't quite where we want it to be at the moment. And when you create these decision boundaries for how your machine needs to operate, you're also creating decision boundaries between different types of people. And those decision boundaries then replicate and further drive the boundaries that already exist in the world. So I'd like to say it's not these systems that make mistakes, it's us. It's us in the way we've structured the society that we try to get machines to iterate on. It's us in how we define the problems they will solve. It's us in the mistakes that we make when we develop them, and then how we use them. And I mean, I came across a Twitter thread this morning about the most recent drama with Zoom and Twitter not being able to recognize some people's faces as well as others. And I mean, in the comment section, I came across all sorts of comments where people kept on saying, oh, it's bias in the algorithmic data. That's why the algorithm makes the decisions that it does. And it makes me angry, because bias is identifiable when the people who create that system and when the people who test that system are aware that that bias may even be a thing. And when we claim that it's machines that make mistakes, or it's the data that we fed to the machines to make mistakes, what we're really doing is just allowing the machine to reflect who we really are. And so it's us, not them. And we need to protect these machines and the potential that they can provide to the world through not allowing them to see all these terrible parts of ourselves, and not allowing them to perpetuate, replicate, and mimic those parts of ourselves. And as I mentioned earlier, I mean, thinking about all of this stuff in even just this presentation is a lot to think about. And I mentioned before, like me as a data scientist sitting in the bank, when I have my executive demanding in terms of timelines what I need to deliver, and all sorts of things, I can go through all the checklists about what I need to do to make sure that I am following the rules of good AI. But I think one of the major things that I'm grappling with at the moment, and what I would like to leave you with, if you slept through everything else, is the question, who do you want to empower, and who are you disempowering in the process? Or as Cathy O'Neill says, who wins and who loses? And I think when we start to ask ourselves these who questions at the machine contextualization phase, then we're starting off on the right foot, and we're starting to address the social issues that are seeping into the machines that we create. And then not trying to cover up these social issues with technical solutions, social and political issues with technical solutions. We're addressing ourselves because we are the problem. So when I spoke about that person earlier, saying my subject is brainwaves, not people, that was me, like around 2018. And I've come to a different place, of course, especially through doing this presentation. And I think if I were to go back and change the name of my thesis title, it would specifically mention that I was looking at images of male heterozygous GAD67 GFP knocking mice, basically Parkinson's model mice. And I mean, this is a little bit of a joke to commemorate the little mousies. But I think, again, it's just to drive home my desire to share with you and with everyone else to just think about contextualizing your work and being transparent about who it's for and who it's not for, and to communicate through that process that you're thinking about these things, every step of the process of the machines that you create or the work that you create, even if you're not creating machines. So these are 4 people that I discovered through this process. Karen is the director of the neuroethics. Of a neuroethics department, maybe somebody. Okay, I don't know. But yeah, she doesn't have a Twitter handle, but she does have a website with a lot of useful links and a lot of useful information and a lot of training material in terms of understanding a little bit more about what the community is thinking about and what direction they're heading in. And I think does have a Twitter page that she doesn't tweet too much on, but was also quite important in terms of the articles I read and the papers I read in order to inform some of the information that I presented here. And then the last 2, Philip Kilmeyer and Marcello, lenca, I came across a lot. And they are specifically involved in neuroethics. So if you want to go more into this, there's also that neuroethics blog that I've put on the left there. It's really, really interesting, especially when things get super philosophical. But yeah, that's it for me. I think I need to go turn on my light. Yes, I do. My final words to you are Trokomela Mioskawa Buefo, which in Setswana, my father's language, means be careful, but don't be afraid. Yeah. And I really want to hear from you, even if it's just stories or rebuttals or correcting me on anything. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. Ooh. This was so great. We'll give you a moment to quickly switch on your light if you want.
Yes, please.
Perfect. In the meantime, I just want to ask everyone if there are any last questions before we get. This is always the fun part, so we do encourage your questions. And then also, thanks to everyone who has voted in the polls. And also, please show your appreciation by voting in our polls. Yeah, and then I think I'll give it a minute or so. We'll just wait for Pelonomi to return, and then we'll get started with the Q&A. Okay. So yeah, any last questions are welcome. Let me just see if I can also get Siobhan back online. Oh, she's asking in the comments. No, you're not on screen. I'll quickly re-invite you. Okay. Pelonomi, I don't know if you, in the meantime, maybe want to check out the polls also. There were quite a few.
I am checking out the polls now.
Oh, you are? Okay, awesome.
Yeah. And I'm very relieved. Because everyone's on my side.
There are people.
Yeah, there are people, which is great. But also that there's hope for neuroscience and machine learning, because people seem to be, I suppose those are the types of people these kinds of talks attract. But yeah, so for example, do you think neural models work as well on Black females as they do on white males? I asked that question on Instagram, and it was something like a 45-55 split, which was really concerning for me, because I think that there's a large understanding within technical communities that there's a problem, but I don't think we're communicating that problem to the general public very well. which is super concerning to me. But also, it's really interesting. Most people here are in the exploratory part of neuroscience, and they're like, how comfortable would you feel about scientists having access to your brainwaves? And everyone was like, not comfortable at all. Which makes me wonder where you get your data from.
But I mean, these questions are so relevant, though.
They are, and I'm really happy that there's people thinking about it, because like I said, it is early phases, both in terms of developing neurotechnology and also just in terms of us understanding how to make good machines. Yeah.
Definitely. Oh, I see we have Siobhan with us. Welcome back, Siobhan.
Yeah, she's back.
Thanks. It took me a while.
Okay, I will hand over to you now. You can run the Q&A.
So,
oh, there we go. She disappeared again.
Oh, I can see myself.
no, she's here.
Oh, okay, sorry. Might be on mine. Okay, Siobhan, over to you.
Perfect. I'm going to start off with might be a personal question, Pelonomi, but in the beginning you mentioned that you had aspirations to work at Neuralink. I'm wondering if anything that you spoke about today factored into your decision to not pursue that path, or was it other circumstances?
I think it was access. I wanted to come back and make a difference in my country, and I think at that stage, maybe Stellenbosch and maybe Cape Town had postgraduate degrees in biomedical engineering and maybe had some kind of neuroscience lab, but I didn't necessarily want to go into research. And there just wasn't a space here for me to be able to practice my love and passion for brains and my love and passion for machines. So I ended up at a bank. Yeah, I think things are changing now, especially with platforms like these, and I'm sure, as everyone knows in this forum, that this stuff is quite new and it's quite cutting edge and it's quite exciting. So I think there'll be even more opportunities for people in the future, which is super exciting.
Cool. Thanks. So our first question is from Mohammed. I'm going to phrase it slightly differently, but still ask the question. So it's speaking about the actual data sets that these algorithms are trained upon, with the typical response being, let's use more data, which I'm going to assume from your talk is not good enough. But what would your suggestions be in terms of data collection in addressing these issues?
I mean, when you do this data collection, you're supposed to do an EDA, right? An explorative data analysis. And one approach is to do an explorative data analysis with fairness in mind. Google has a really nice notebook that takes you through that kind of process, where you start looking and identifying the possible minorities that the data set may isolate, and then ensuring that any modeling you do or any data analysis you do, checking to see how it then performs against those different minorities within the data set. Now, this can be super tricky if you're a person who's unable to identify minorities for whatever reason. Maybe you've lived in a bubble your whole life or on a little island. So that can be quite difficult to do. But I think starting with a list of previously marginalized communities within your context is an important place to look, to ensure that you're not disadvantaging them anymore. And yeah, more data is great, especially if it helps you to broaden your reach. But it can be really difficult because, for example, like take America, for example, where they have a very small population of African American and Latinx communities, right? And you have a very large white community. If you wanted to have a data set that was broadly representative of reality, then you would have small populations for the Latinx community and African American community, and then large representation of the white community, right? And statistically, that would make sense. And statistically, that's what's available to you, because it's not like you can sample what is not there. So, I mean, in the presentation, I talk about how fairness, equality is not necessarily equity. So sometimes you do have to do a little bit more than just getting more data and ensuring that more data gives you a distribution in the way that your model responds in the way that you want it to, and not so that the model responds in the way that society is structured, because you want to fix that. You don't want to just replicate it. Having said that, I'm doing a lot of Twitter work, and the more data you get, the more noise you get. And I think it's similar with looking at brainwaves. There's a lot of noise. So it's also something that's ensuring that your data quality is good, not just more data. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Next question relates to informed consent. So a lot of the applications of these algorithms and devices are aimed at the general population, who don't necessarily have degrees in computer science or engineering or any knowledge of these background things. And like you said, some people are in a bit of a bubble, or they've been on an island. So how do we make sure that these devices that are aimed at the population, how do we make sure that they can be used with them understanding the risks, and not just adopting blindly, but actually being able to opt out of these applications?
I mean, it's crazy, because opting out isn't as easy as it seems. Like, I tried to opt out of using Zoom and it has not worked. But that aside, and I mean, if there's anybody here who is more equipped to answer this question than me, then please do. But I do think, I mean, I've been in close proximity to teams who are like, yeah, let's just put it in the terms and conditions and make it really small. Nobody will see it. And I think a very clear, and one of my favorite examples of this was that Face app that changed your app into an old person. And I think it was owned by a Russian company. I stand to be corrected. And somewhere in the terms and conditions, it just talks about how the images you send to them are for them to use for whatever purposes they choose to use it for. It no longer belongs to you. They can just do whatever they want, and there's no way you can get that data back. There's no way that you can ask them to remove it. It belongs to them. And everybody was just like, ooh, Face app, I want to be a granny. Just like, click, yes, approve terms and conditions. And maybe if you aren't a tech person, I often have to try and convince people why privacy is important, and why autonomy is important, and why access to their own information is valuable. But it's quite difficult to do. So to answer that question, I don't know how you get people to take terms and conditions and risks more seriously, especially when there are so many risks involved in a process. I think it's a combination of very clever communication and a lot of transparency on the company's part to make sure that they're not trying to wiggle their way into people's lives with secrets. I think that's a difficult question.
Yeah, just a comment from my side. One of the most illuminating comments I've heard from someone on this topic is by saying it's like thinking about freedom of speech. You just so not advocating for privacy, or even if you don't understand why, just advocating for privacy, not advocating for it is like kind of like saying, well, I'm not going to advocate for freedom of speech because I have nothing to say. So if you want to say I have nothing to hide, I'm not going to advocate for. But it, the two kind of link up. So that one kind of sunk in with, and it doesn't require any knowledge of anything.
Yeah, maybe I should use that approach, because I'll be like to them, you know what I can do with your data?
Yeah,
and they don't understand the threat.
Yeah, I'll look it up. It came from a book that someone referenced. I'll look up the exact quotes. I did butcher it a bit, but it I think I got the point across. Cool. Then our last question, unless someone wants to sneak some in at the end. So just accepting the state where we're at now, or not accepting it, but just using that as the baseline. Do you think that, well, this baseline with this ingrained bias and discrimination, do you think that it would be possible to correct these while going forward with progress simultaneously, or have we perhaps reached a point where we need a clean slate?
So, I mean, one of the things I did put down there was with 2018 Pelonomi was about sharing neural data and just making it open source and open access to everyone. And I think with the concerns that we've already expressed with neuroprivacy, we can kind of identify how that may be an issue. But in the same sense, especially within the African context, we're really just trying to give everybody whatever they need in order to try and catch up, you know. And I think to some extent, thinking about these things while you're trying to catch up is a inhibitor as well as a stimulator in ways that I think people who are thinking about this now, I think it'll put you ahead of the masses when it comes down to things, and people understand at some point that it's really, really important. But I do think that it may slow things down a little in the process, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, global warming may take some time to finish us all off, and I think before that time, we still have a lot of exploring to do, and I think it's important that we do it the right way. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a bit of a shy audience tonight, but I think we can give you 1 or 2 more minutes if anybody has some questions they'd like to sneak in. Otherwise, I'll hand over to Julianne to finish off the session.
Perfect. Yeah, I think let's give it a couple more seconds. Come on, guys. Questions? Yeah, but this is such an interesting topic, though. Like you said now, with the poll question also, the same question being asked now, and how people responded differently before. The answers to the polls and the questions you ask probably differ quite sort of vastly depending on the audience you're presenting it to.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we all need to do a better job of informing our non-technical friends about what is going on. Because ultimately it is them who uses this stuff, and you're protecting your loved ones when you're letting them know. So yeah, I need to stop presenting it tech things.
Okay, cool. It doesn't seem like anything is coming in, so I think I will finish the session then. Let me just quickly share my screen. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so as we have said, thank you again, Pelonomi. This was such a cool talk. And like we said, very, very relevant. And yeah, can everyone please show some appreciation just by giving Pelonomi a virtual round of applause in the comments section. And then we would also like to thank all of you for attending. Yeah, it's always fun when there's interaction and audience involvement. And then, like Siobhan also mentioned in the comments, remember to join our mailing list. The link is available at the bottom of the screen. So you can just follow the link there and then sign up to find out more about future NERV events. And then we also like to thank our sponsors, Stellenbosch University and the Biomedical Engineering Research Group. And then lastly, I want to wish our South African audience, live and otherwise, a very happy Heritage Day happening tomorrow. Okay, and with that, we will then say thank you and good night. Bye, everyone.
Bye.